Good day. Today is Thursday, 22nd May 2025, and as you can see, I am back in London, though I have a mountain of things to do, and I'm also, to say it straightforwardly, somewhat tired after the journey, and well, we'll see how long this video turns out to be. But before I turn to the main topics of this video, I do want to discuss relatively briefly, the state of Russia as I experienced it when I was there. I'm not talking about the politics, President Putin's position, policy about the war, anything of that kind, but my general impressions of the country, or to be precise, the very small part of this absolutely gigantic country that I visited and which I saw whilst I was there. And the first thing I have to say, and I think it's an important point, and I've touched on it in previous programs that I made whilst I was in Russia, is that speaking specifically about St. Petersburg, there's no doubt at all, in my opinion, that it is substantially more wealthy than it was when I was last there, which was in 2016. Now, that was 9 years ago, so a lot of time has passed since then. One would expect economic progress, but the fact is there has been economic progress in those 9 years, and there has been a lot of it. The city looks better, if I can say it, than I have ever seen it. It was incredibly clean. One never saw anywhere any signs of rubbish. There was no graffiti anywhere that I could see. The public transport system, I didn't use it, but my impression was it was working extremely well. And judging from the appearance of the people and from the shops that I visited, like the big bookshop on Nevsky Prospect, well, there appears to have been an upgrade in absolutely every respect. The second is that there was no visible sign of economic distress. We've been hearing a huge amount about the sanctions, about the pressure of the sanctions, about the Russia being some kind of war economy or being operated on military Keynesian lines and all of that. Well, I saw none of the signs that I have seen in other places which speak of an economy under stress. No windows, shop windows shuttered, empty spaces and shops and things of that kind. No sign, as I said, the public services weren't functioning. I've already mentioned the complete absence, the extraordinary absence of litter anywhere, but it goes beyond that, and the fact that there was no graffiti, it goes beyond that. I never saw any beggars, I never saw homeless people, obviously living on the streets, nothing of that kind. The parks were extremely well kept. I was impressed by how well kept they are. I should say that one of the things I did over the course of my visit was that I visited the grounds of the Palace of Tsarskoye Selo, one of the major palaces outside St. Petersburg. And I was struck by how beautifully this park was kept. It reminded me of Kew Gardens in London, except that it was actually in a better state than I found Kew Gardens to be. Everything was shiny, clean, and the gardens themselves were in immaculate state. The trees, the plants, all clearly looked after, the grass cut, all of that. And this wasn't just in one place, it was true of all the other parks that I visited as well. So public services clearly working. And none of the other signs of distress that I've encountered in so many other places. The shady people who walk up to you if you're walking in the street, offering to change your money or to offer you various other services, that kind of thing. The people in the shops coming out and offering you all kinds of deals to try to sell the things that they're looking to sell. There's nothing of that kind at all. In countries which are under genuine economic pressure, that becomes immediately noticeable. It's one of the first things I've noticed that starts to happen. Bear in mind that cash has to be brought into Russia if you're a Western visitor, because your cards don't work there. You have to bring cash with you. And that is almost an invitation to the shady characters I was talking about, making themselves available to change your money at what they claim to be preferential rates. But I saw absolutely nothing like that any at the time I was there. And I would say that because I visited St. Petersburg directly after I attended the legal forum, I went out of the legal forum into a waiting car, and it drove me to St. Petersburg. I was, of course, dressed in my Western business suit, which would have immediately identified me as a Westerner. I was accompanied by a local person for some of the time, but I was left for a significant part of the time by myself in Senate Square, near the statue, the famous galloping statue of Peter the Great, an obvious place for that sort of thing to happen. And as I said, no one approached me at all, and I didn't get the impression that anybody was remotely interested or even thinking about doing anything like that. And well, you could come up with all kinds of other things. You could imagine shops or restaurants where they offer to sell you things or supply you with food at preferential rates if you pay illegally in foreign currency. Well, there was absolutely nothing of that kind going on at all, anywhere, everywhere. It was absolutely clear that the ruble was the currency you had to have if you were going to buy anything. So I don't want to dwell on this. I don't want to take up more time on this point. But overall, the city seemed to be functioning completely normally, in a completely healthy way. There were no visible signs, as I said, of economic distress, which I could see. And for the record, I thought people looked a lot better dressed than they used to. The shops are much more interesting and have more variety than they used to have. And perhaps it's only a superficial impression, but I was on Nevsky Prospect, which is the main road in St. Petersburg, and I noticed, again, an obvious absence of Western brands, even Western articles in the shops. And again, this is a particularly superficial impression. The food in the various restaurants, which is very good, by the way, the ones I saw tended to be all but exclusively Russian, except that you do still see restaurants that offer the food of the various nations of the Caucasus, especially Georgian food, which has become an integral part of Russian culture for many, many decades indeed now. Indeed, arguably going all the way back to the early 20th century. So there we are. That's my impression of the city. I saw no sign, nothing that suggested to me economic distress or economic instability. The signs of that were nowhere to be found. Now, to repeat again, this is St. Petersburg. It is one of the two capitals. It could be that conditions in other places in this enormous country are profoundly different. I can only judge by what I saw. But against that, I've no obvious reason to suspect that things are that radically different in other places. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this topic. No doubt much more could be said indeed. I would quickly say, express here a thanks to all of those people who showed me extraordinary generosity when I was in St. Petersburg. Particularly one person who maybe wished watching these programs, who was the person who accompanied me and helped me with cars and all of those sort of things. And well, I have to say it was an extraordinary trip. It was a wonderful trip altogether, and the legal forum I attended was a place where extraordinary interesting things were discussed and said, and where I learnt, speaking for myself, a very great deal indeed, which I will no doubt return to over the course of future programs. Anyway, let's now turn to the big news of the last 24 hours since I did my program. My last program, which is of course my last program made in St. Petersburg. Now, in that program, I discussed the very, very strong warning given by the vice chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, former president and prime minister of Russia, and also, incidentally, the head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. So he is the man who at least supervises, even if he doesn't run, Russia's military industrial complex. So he's, there, keeping an eye on things. And I discussed yesterday how he gave Ukraine purportedly a very stark warning that either you negotiate seriously and come to an agreement basically on Russian terms, or in the alternative, it will be war until the end, until your unconditional surrender. That is the stark choice that Medvedev outlined in his speech, the speech which I discussed yesterday. Well, since then, since Medvedev spoke in that way, we've had various comments, discussions about things in the media in the West and from Western officials. And over the last couple of hours, there's been a significant amount of, well, I'm not going to say it's information, but claims about some of the things that Donald Trump is supposed to have told the Europeans, the European leaders he spoke to, European leaders apart from Keir Starmer, after his conversation with Putin. Apparently he told the European leaders that Putin believes that he is winning the war. That is absolutely correct. Putin does believe he is winning the war, and the reason he believes that is because he, or to be more precise, Russia, is indeed winning the war. And the fact that Putin believes that he is winning the war obviously disinclines him to make significant concessions. Why should he make concessions if he is winning the war? Now, that, I've no doubt Trump said, it is consistent with everything we know. But I have been receiving, I've seen in some places, further claims based on what Trump said, which appear to go beyond that. They imply, or they say, that Trump also told the Europeans that he, that is to say Donald Trump, also believes that the Russians are going to win the war. Now, whether Trump really said that or not, I really don't know. I think it highly likely, and it could be, that Trump has received briefings from the Pentagon, from the US intelligence community, which one should remember is now headed by Tulsi Gabbard and John Radcliffe, respectively the Director of National Intelligence and the head of the CIA. It could be that these people are now briefing Trump based on information they have, that Russia is indeed not just winning the war, but going to win the war. But I have to say, I'm not 100% certain, I cannot be 100% certain, that Trump really did convey that message to the Europeans. If he did, they would have been horrified to hear it, collectively horrified to hear it, because it would be, from their point of view, a statement of heresy, saying that Russia is going to win the war, basically notwithstanding or irrespective of anything that the United States and the West does. That is absolutely not a message that anybody in the European Union wants to hear. It is also a message that some people in Congress also seem to find very difficult to accept. Marco Rubio, as I discussed in my program yesterday, went to Congress and he had to field some, I thought, absolutely weird questions from various members of Congress who were basically trying to push him into taking a much stronger line against Russia, or at least committing himself to supporting a much stronger line against Russia than Rubio clearly wanted. And Rubio, of course, is a skilled lawyer, and he answered these questions well. And I should say that I'm not certain of his deep personal beliefs, but I still found the whole tone of the questions and the content of some of these questions completely extraordinary. There still seemed to be a belief that the United States can provide Ukraine with the weapons material that it needs to win the war. Now, we've had 3 years of a Democrat administration, the Biden administration to be precise. They provided tens of billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine. They provided vast amount of ammunition to Ukraine. They provided enormous degrees of intelligence to Ukraine. The New York Times recently released a long, detailed discussion of the conduct of the war, and it turned out that the war was being conducted mostly by American generals, and that there was even a headquarters in Wiesbaden that was basically running the war, and that it was the United States that chose the objectives, made the plans, picked the weapons that were adapted to fulfill the plans, trained the troops, gave orders to the Ukrainian generals, did all of these things in order to achieve victory over Russia. And yet, people in Congress, there are people in Congress who apparently genuinely believe that the United States can still win the war if it does even more than that. I'm not sure what they think that the United States could actually do more than that, over and above what it has already done. To give some examples, supply F-35 fighter jets to Ukraine, a disastrous idea, in my opinion. It would be a massive undertaking to train Ukrainian pilots to fly these fighter jets, and the idea of providing them with base facilities in Ukraine, boggles the imagination. F-35s are even more tricky to maintain than F-16s are, and Ukraine, by all accounts, is having difficulties doing that. What other weapons can be supplied? The F-35s, if there was a decision to supply them, we would be looking at a program that would take years to achieve its effect. And of course, Ukraine doesn't have those years, not at all. It is losing the war now. So what exactly are these great weapons that Ukraine could be provided by the United States that is going to change the direction of the war? And I say that because that was still the demand, and there is now a huge narrative, and it is a narrative that has been seized on by all kinds of people, that the reason Ukraine is losing is because the West has provided Ukraine with just enough weapons to keep fighting and to defend itself, but never enough to win. And that narrative has been seized upon and taken up by people like Boris Johnson, and is repeated endlessly, except of course it is obviously untrue. Now, the person who has discussed the degree to which the West is constrained by its own capabilities in arming Ukraine is Brian Belletic. He has discussed this in many, many programs, and I cannot improve on what he has said. But Marco Rubio, over the course of his various comments, has given examples. He said that the United States has indeed tried, for example, to increase supplies of Patriot missile interceptors and Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. The trouble is, there aren't that many around. Countries that have Patriot missile systems are not willing to donate them to Ukraine, despite the fact that the Americans have apparently on several occasions asked them to. Israel is reluctantly coming round to doing that. Germany is going to do that. But the many other countries that have Patriot missiles have said, no thank you, we're holding on to our Patriot missiles and we're holding on to our batteries. And Rubio said actual production of new missiles in the United States is simply not enough to keep up with Ukraine's demands. And that is obviously true. So, what is this vast stockpile of weapons that are going to be sent to Ukraine? The Europeans don't have any. The Americans have sent an awful lot. No doubt they could continue to send more, but none of what has been provided up to now has worked. But still, some people seem to think that sending a few dozen more Abrams tanks or Bradley infantry fighting vehicles or whatever is going to turn the tide of the battle in Ukraine. No, it isn't. And then, of course, there's the topic of sanctions. And this topic comes up all the time in every way. It appears incessantly. And the level of ignorance about this topic, again, frankly astonishes me. So, in the Daily Telegraph yesterday, there was an article by Robert Clark, who was incredibly angry with the fact that Trump apparently got on very well with Putin over the course of this telephone conversation. And he says that in less than 4 months, this is in this article, Trump's strategy to dealing with Putin has lurched from sympathetic ally, then to annoyance, to threats of increasing military aid to Ukraine, seen as a near existential threat by the Kremlin. I'm not sure about that, by the way. What exactly does Robert Clark think that means? But if increasing military aid to Ukraine is indeed considered by the Kremlin a near existential threat, then given that the Kremlin controls the world's biggest nuclear arsenal, might it be wise to think carefully before increasing military aid to Ukraine? Just saying. But anyway, and then Robert Clark says that the new line taken by Trump over the course of his conversation with Putin, over the course of the 2-hour call, was to now promises of unlimited trade with the US. And then the next line absolutely left me gasping. The right strategy to follow from the start was, of course, severely limiting Russia's access to US-led global financial markets. Well, haven't we been doing that for the last 3 years? Isn't that exactly what the sanctions are all about? Is that why Western cards, credit and debit cards, don't work in Russia? Isn't that why Russian banks have been disconnected from the SWIFT interbank payment system? Is it why it is incredibly difficult to find anywhere in Britain, for example, where you can change rubles into pounds sterling? Isn't it why the Russian central bank reserves have been frozen in the West? What exactly is it suggested that the West should do beyond what has already been done in order to severely limit Russia's access to US-led global financial markets? Now, the extraordinary thing is that when I was in Russia, the entire financial system came across to me as entirely stable. People are paying for things with cards and with QR codes and doing all of those kinds of things. I saw that done repeatedly. I saw that happen in a restaurant when I dined. Of course, they're not using Western cards. So, limiting Russia's access to the US-led global financial markets has not produced the result that Robert Clark apparently thinks it would. But apparently he's stuck on that idea and he still talks about it. Now, the other plan, as I said, which is Lindsey Graham's plan and which is now also being discussed in Europe. Apparently Ursula von der Leyen is saying that this is her latest great new plan. The latest plan is to unite with Lindsey Graham and to pass sanctions which are not going to be actually sanctions against Russia at all. Because what they supposedly do is impose 500% sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil and gas, energy products. Now, those are not, strictly speaking, sanctions against Russia. They're sanctions against other countries which might decide that they want to buy oil and gas from Russia. Well, I am not going to discuss in this program the complete unreality of that plan. I have already discussed it in many programs already. I will just say that, again, the fact that we're no longer talking about sanctioning Russia, but sanctioning different countries other than Russia in order to stop them buying Russian oil, tells us the extent to which this whole idea of sanctions is now past the point of complete exhaustion. And for the record, I had some very interesting conversations whilst I was in St. Petersburg at the Legal Forum, including from one person in particular, but also, I should say, I touched on this topic with others, who pointed out to me one of the great paradoxes of the latest plan that the European Union has also come up with, which is to lower the price cap on Russian oil. The cap that prevents Western shippers from obtaining insurance in the West if the oil that they convey on their ships is priced above the cap, then they're denied insurance in the West. It has to be below the cap. Now, the current cap is $60 a barrel. The price of oil has recently fallen, probably because people worry that there is a recession coming in the West, but there might be other reasons. So the proposal has been to reduce it. Some say to $50 a barrel, some say to $30 a barrel. Who knows at what level? And that is a hopeless idea. The price cap, when it was enforced, well, it couldn't be enforced. It didn't work. It didn't prevent the Russians from selling oil above the cap. Why do people believe that it would work this time? Well, I'm going to say that when I was in St. Petersburg, going back to those discussions I had there, I was told something very, very interesting, that it is absolutely the case, as I've discussed in many programs, that nowadays ship owners are not limited to London in obtaining their insurance. In fact, the London insurance market basically has a relatively small role in this sector, contrary to what many Western governments appear to believe. However, there are certain forms of maritime insurance that only certain very large insurance groups are able to provide. They're not restricted to any one country, but they need to have very deep capital reserves in order to be able to provide this type of insurance. Now, one of them happens to be a major Russian insurance group. It was recently sanctioned. Now, the paradox here is that that particular Russian insurance group, and I have its name, but I'm not going to dwell on this too much, that particular Russian insurance group was being very careful to apply the sanctions because it didn't want to jeopardize part of its business. But it has now been sanctioned anyway. So, from this moment on, it is completely free to start providing this particular type of maritime insurance to ships that form part of the oil trade involving Russia. Ships which the West would say were part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. And that, apparently, has actually now started to happen. So, in sanctioning that particular insurance group has expanded opportunities for shippers to obtain insurance, which they might not have been able to do or might have had greater difficulty in doing otherwise. Again, I've said this many times, the people who constantly advocate and push for these additional sanctions often don't themselves understand their own effect. Reading the commentary at the time when the oil price cap was first imposed back in 2022, 2023, it was obvious to me that Western governments still believed that London played a far bigger role in this industry than it actually does. They just have not managed to keep up with the times. Now, whilst I was at the legal forum, inevitably discussions about sanctions came up. And my overwhelming impression is that nobody there was afraid of sanctions. There was none of that nervousness and anxiety about sanctions that existed in February 2022, when nobody really knew what the effect of the sanctions would be. So this time, the Russians are taking things much more calmly than they did then. But I ought to say that even though the Russians are taking the sanctions calmly, not only are they thinking of pushing back on the sanctions themselves, but they are talking with each other about things that Western governments might do, which go well beyond sanctions and which have the appearance, to my mind, of extreme recklessness. And the Russians, or at least some Russians, maybe not all Russians, now do genuinely believe that Western governments are actually intent on seizing Russian ships engaged in entirely legal maritime trade on the high seas, doing so on the grounds that they're breaching sanctions, which, to repeat again, are products of Western policy. They're not generally endorsed around the world. Their actual legal force in terms of international law has never been explained in ways that I find remotely satisfactory. Anyway, Western governments are talking now about, or at least the Russians believe that Western governments are talking now about trying to enforce these sanctions by seizing ships on the high seas. Not just Russian ships, but ships of owners, ship owners, who are not Russian. And, well, there was a first attempt to do that a few days ago. The Estonians tried to board and seize a ship that was sailing in the Baltic Sea. The crew apparently put up resistance. A Sukhoi 35 fighter jet appeared on the scene, and the Estonians were forced to pull back. Then the Russians responded a day or so later by seizing an Estonian ship, which apparently is still being held in Russia. But anyway, there is increasing talk that all of this might happen. And the Russians are now talking about using their navy to take countermeasures to stop this from happening. That there's even discussions, in other words, about creating convoys protected by Russian warships to ensure that Russia's maritime trade through the Baltic Sea is able to continue unimpeded. This was previously an idea that was floated by Putin's senior aide, Nikolai Patrushev, who is in overall charge of the Russian shipbuilding industry and indeed the upgrading of Russia's navy. And it appears to be something that the Russians are now seriously preparing for. All I would say is that this is an astonishing action. The Russians creating convoys with warships to protect merchant ships which are threatened by seizure by Western navies. I mean, I cannot imagine any type of scenario more likely to achieve or bring about or cause an armed clash than this absolutely harebrained idea. And to repeat again, this is clearly an act contrary to international law, and seizing ships in that way, in my opinion, would be a straightforward act of war, and which takes us back to the issue of many of these sanctions, that they function in a strange legal netherworld between war and peace. The countries that impose these sanctions claim that they are at peace, even as they take steps which amount to acts of war. Anyway, for the moment, Donald Trump himself doesn't seem to be interested in any of this. He made a very interesting statement in which he said that ultimately the only person who's going to decide whether there are any sanctions or not, further sanctions I should say, is he himself, nobody else. And that seemed to me a clear warning to Lindsey Graham and to the various other senators. The Senate has now just passed Trump's big, beautiful bill. The Senate and the House has passed the big, beautiful bill, which is the tax cuts and all of that. So I suspect that Trump feels that he's in a stronger position to talk in that way. And going back to this idea of Ursula von der Leyen's, of trying to, or threatening sanctions, tariffs on countries that buy Russian energy, ultimately, those sort of sanctions would only be even theoretically effective against other countries if the United States were prepared to join in. And it seems to me that if a sanctions bill were put together, but Donald Trump made absolutely clear that he did not support it, I suspect that much of that support for this bill that Lindsey Graham is talking about, the 80 senators who he says have told him that they will back it, I suspect that much of that support will melt away. Now, I think that there is a body of opinion within the US Senate which still takes a very hardline view of Russia. I think the mood is different amongst Republicans in the House. I think that, as I said, it's difficult to imagine such a bill passing, and if Trump made known that he intended to veto it, I think it would almost immediately die. So there we go. Those are the plans that the Europeans are discussing. They've apparently, between themselves, come to recognize that they're not going to be able to keep arming Ukraine if the Americans cease to do so. There are major disputes within Europe about buying arms from the United States to go on arming Ukraine. Whether the Americans would be prepared to continue doing that indefinitely is another question, given that they are also trying to build up their own stockpiles. But we come back to the point that I was making in my program yesterday. The Western powers are now out of options. Russia's trading partners, the Chinese, the Indians, all of the others, keen for all sorts of good practical reasons to maintain their trading links with Russia, and that makes an economic blockade with Russia all but impossible. Even if that economic blockade were applied, undoubtedly that would create stresses and problems inside Russia itself. But in my assessment, nowhere near enough to change Russian policy or to bring about the kind of economic collapse that the West imagines that it would. And in military terms, there is nothing that the West can do to prevent the situation developing as it is. Now, the Russians know it. Putin had a very remarkable exchange with people from Kursk region when he was discussing the situation there. And several of them, well, the question was put to him, shouldn't we, as part of this buffer zone to protect Kursk region that we have been talking about, not seriously consider capturing the city of Sumy in Sumy region, 30 kilometers from the Russian border? That a capture of this city is essential to create an effective buffer zone. And Putin did not disagree. He didn't say that was a Russian objective. He never, by the way, says it goes into detail as to what Russian battlefield objectives are. He shouldn't. That's obviously information for the military, not for him to disclose. It's heavily classified. But I noticed that when the idea of the Russians capturing Sumy, the city of Sumy, was floated, Putin didn't immediately shoot it down. Now, a year ago, back in May 2024, at exactly this time, there was a discussion about whether or not the Russians would establish a buffer zone, which would include Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv itself. There was no doubt that the Russians were going to send forces into Kharkiv region along the border. Putin had talked about creating a buffer zone there, and indeed the Russians did eventually cross the border and enter Kharkiv region, and they're still there, of course. But there was a lot of discussion at one time that the Russians, and in the West at least, that the Russians, ultimately their major objective in this area was capturing the city of Kharkiv, the capital of Kharkiv region. And some have tried to claim that the Russian operation in Kharkiv region has been a failure because the Russians didn't capture the city of Kharkiv. What those people don't say, and what is in such contrast to what Putin has failed to say about Sumy, is that when the idea of capturing the city of Kharkiv was proposed at this time last year, Putin went out of his way to shoot it down. He said that what he wanted was a buffer zone along the border. He was not aiming, the Russians were not aiming to capture the city of Kharkiv itself. Now, the same question has been put to him, this time about Sumy, and in extraordinary contrast, this time he said nothing. He's not said yes, and he's not said no. He's left the question open. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians are, in fact, planning to capture the city of Sumy. It may be that they want to keep the Ukrainians guessing. But what it does show is how confident Putin indeed has become about the state of the war. And this is consistent, obviously, with what Medvedev was saying yesterday, and it is consistent with other things that Putin himself has said. So, the West is without military leverage. It may not fully grasp this, but it is also without political leverage as well. Now, what is extraordinary about all of this is that there seems to be, as I said, an extraordinary degree of inability to accept that fact either. Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism has forwarded to me an article which appeared in Foreign Policy, one of the big heavyweight American magazines that discuss foreign policy in the United States. It's taken very seriously. It's considered to be a very heavyweight magazine indeed. Anyway, this article actually has this incredible title. It says that Russia has started losing the war in Ukraine. The military tide may have turned against Putin. And it's published by Michael Kimmage, director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington. And it goes through explanations of why this article thinks that, in fact, it's Ukraine rather than Russia which is currently winning the war in Ukraine. There are qualifiers. The article does acknowledge that the Russians are gaining more and more territory every day, but the article also acknowledges that this is a war of attrition, and it is a war of attrition which supposedly the Russians are losing. Their economy is buckling, their losses are enormous, they won't be able to continue the momentum of this for very much longer. I remember, by the way, reading similar articles in the summer of last year even as the Russians powered westwards towards the Dnieper. Well, I'm not going to analyse this article in detail. All I would say is that it might be useful to people who write articles like this to go beyond the headlines of what is written in the Ukrainian media and to focus instead on what is actually being said on Ukrainian social media, in the various Telegram channels, by Ukrainian military officers, because, of course, they have a radically different view. For the first time over the course of this conflict, the Ukrainians are admitting that the Russians are not only winning the drone war in terms of scale, they've admitted this also at various times, but that Russian drones are becoming more sophisticated and more advanced and more effective than Ukrainian drones. The Ukrainians up to recently have claimed that it is their drones that are better than the Russian drones, and their drone operators who are more skilled than Russian drone operators are. Well, that view is starting to become increasingly challenged. But I've been reading over the last week or so stories in Ukrainian social media about military officers, including from the elite 47th Mechanized Brigade, complaining about irrational orders. Some of them have resigned, some of them have been sacked. There's been a wave of sackings and dismissals. There's been reports of further desertions. There's been more reports of still more desertions from the Anna of Kiev Brigade, which was French trained. I've heard a claim, by the way, which I think might be true, that the reason Ukraine only sent 11 soldiers to participate in the British Victory Day ceremonies, victory ceremonies, earlier this month, was because they worried that if they sent more soldiers, some of them might choose not to return to Ukraine. So I've been reading all about this, about all of these things, and, well, there's been more and more reports from the ground that also tell a completely different story. So just to give some examples, we've already discussed the situation in Sumy region, where the Russians appear to be advancing, and there's now talk about them capturing the city of Sumy itself. There's been reports that in the Siversk area, the Russians have finally managed to capture conclusively the village of Veliki Kamyanska, which is located just east of Siversk itself. The Russians have previously claimed to have captured this village. Then there were reports, some of them Ukrainian, some of them Russian, saying that this was not true and that the Russian commander in the area had reported the capture of this village and had invented it. And then after that, information appeared which appeared to confirm the presence of Ukrainian troops in that village. And then further information appeared a bit later, which showed Russian soldiers in the eastern part of this village. All of this suggests to me one of those long, grueling, bitter battles for control of this village, which we've seen many times before over the course of this conflict. But now there seems to be no doubt that the Russians are in control of this village, or at least that is the information I'm getting, though there is some talk that the Ukrainians might counterattack and try again to drive the Russians out. But anyway, that particular fortified position has fallen. There is a collapse, and I think both Ukrainian and Russian commentators are increasingly talking about using the word collapse. There's been a collapse of Ukrainian positions. around Konstantinovka. The Russians have been pressing forward around Pokrovsk, and further west, they have now, over the last 24 hours, finally crossed into Dnipro region and taken some positions there, though this is only a small sliver of territory. And, well, others have made calculations on the maps, and they're all agreed that the Russian advance is taking place at a faster speed than last year. And there's also more and more accumulation of claims that the Ukrainians themselves are struggling increasingly to contain these Russian advances, which, to repeat again, are taking place before the main campaign season begins, probably later this month, and without the major commitment of the Russian reserves, the two reserve armies that I have been previously talking about in previous programs. So on what basis is it being said that the military tide has turned against Russia in Ukraine? Now, Donald Trump perhaps understands this, perhaps understands that the military situation cannot be reversed, that further sanctions won't succeed, and it could be that this is what ultimately led to the stance he took over the course of his conversation with Putin, his famous conversation with Putin, that he has a more realistic understanding of the realities of the war than his critics do, and that he is trying to end the war before there is a military collapse, and that he's understood now that the Russians are not going to agree to an unconditional ceasefire, and that this is why he both wants to keep the negotiations going in order to get Ukraine to come to some kind of terms with Russia, which will enable it to preserve itself, but also why he does now generally seem to be taking a step back from the negotiations. And as to this, these media reports that have now been circulating that the Vatican will be taking over from the United States the mediating role, reports which I'd previously discounted, are now starting to look a little bit more interesting. Now, it all began with a Truth Social post that Trump published shortly after his telephone call with Putin, in which he said that the next meeting between the Ukrainians and the Russians might take place in the Vatican. I should say that both the Russians and the Ukrainians give every indication of having been taken completely by surprise by that suggestion. I'm not sure whether the Vatican itself had been consulted about it. That begs the question of why. Why, anyway, does Trump want the discussions to be transferred from Turkey to the Vatican? Could it be that he thinks this will somehow please the new Pope, who is, of course, an American? It's one possibility. Could it be that he was very impressed by the splendors of St. Peter's and the Vatican city-state whilst he was there to attend the previous Pope's funeral when he met Zelensky in St. Peter's Basilica in the circumstances which I have discussed? Possibly. Or could it be that by shuffling this whole thing off onto the Vatican, he's not only distancing the United States from the negotiations, but actually, in a kind of way, shuffling the negotiations towards the Europeans, because Vatican City State is, of course, located in Rome. Rome is the capital of Italy. Italy is a European state. It is a member of NATO and of the EU. And it is, in fact, a key member of NATO and the EU. So that seems to me a little bit like a device to move the negotiations away from where the Americans are to where the Europeans are. In other words, a way of saying to the Europeans, not my problem anymore. It's over to you now. There is another twist to this, because what about Erdogan, President Erdogan? He seemed only too delighted to host the negotiations in Istanbul, which took place last week. Could it be that Erdogan also, after having a 3-hour conversation with Zelensky, came to the conclusion that this negotiation process is a shipwreck, that it's going to collide eventually with the rocks. Zelensky is absolutely incapable of coming to any kind of rational agreement with the Russians. And given that the negotiations are going to fail, get the negotiations out of Turkey, transfer them to the Vatican, because that will mean that when they fail, nobody will be able to say that in any conceivable way that it was Erdogan's fault. Just saying. Anyway, at the moment, there's supposed to be this meeting in the Vatican. We have no idea when this meeting is supposed to take place. Some people think it will be soon. Some people think it'll take a little later than that. The Russians supposedly are still working on a memorandum of some kind that they're intending to present to the Ukrainians at this meeting. The Ukrainians are saying that they won't go to the meeting at all unless the prisoner exchange happens. The Russians are saying that it was they who proposed the prisoner exchange. It's been suggested that this prisoner exchange will result in the entire population of Russian soldiers who are prisoners of war in Ukraine being returned to Russia. In fact, the Ukrainians may hold fewer than 1,000 Russian soldiers prisoner, and that there's reports circulating that in order to make up the numbers, the Russians and the Ukrainians are in discussion with each other about including certain civilians, presumably political enemies of President Zelensky, in this 1,000 total that the Ukrainians, of Russian prisoners, that the Ukrainians are supposed to hand over to the Russians. Well, who knows? Speaking of political opponents of President Zelensky, I do want to say very quickly something about the recent assassination of a prominent lawyer, which is Ukrainian lawyer, which has just taken place in Spain. This individual was at one time an advisor to the former overthrown president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych, the president who was overthrown in the Maidan crisis of February 2014. And he has been living in Spain, which strongly suggests to me that he has not committed any significant criminal acts in Ukraine, because had he done, the Ukrainians would presumably have sought his extradition, and the Spanish would presumably have agreed. Anyway, this person who was living in Spain and who's won a number of libel claims against current Ukrainian officials and the former Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko, he was brutally murdered. He was shot in several places after he had taken his children to school. The effect of this assassination on those children, by the way, is something which I'm amazed that nobody in the West talks about. A brutal, violent killing taking place on the territory of a NATO country and eliminating a political opponent or a potential opponent of President Zelensky. Well, Western reaction, completely uninterested, entirely indifferent. There's been reporting of the story, but no attempt to really grapple fully with its implications. Contrast that with certain assassinations that have taken place in Britain, when certain individuals were killed, resulting in claims that made by the British Prime Minister that it was highly likely that the Russians were responsible, leading to sanctions against Russia and all sorts of pompous statements about how unacceptable and uncivilized that kind of behavior is. Well, contrast that with what has just happened in Spain and the complete absence of any condemnation or criticism of it. No highly likely statements in this case. Anyway, there we go. It's quite likely that some political opponents of President Zelensky will be taken out of Ukrainian prisons and included in this 1,000 prisoner swap to make up the Ukrainian numbers. And the Russians say that it was they who proposed this prisoner swap, and that might have been the intention all along. Well, there we are. This is a strange moment in the war. My own sense, my increasing sense, is that Medvedev's statement yesterday was made after consultation with Putin, that it in no way suggests divisions or splits within the Kremlin, that the leadership, the Russian leadership, after speaking with Trump, have concluded that Trump does indeed understand that Ukraine is going to lose the war and that Russia is serious about it, and that Medvedev made that statement in order to make to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans Russia's stance entirely clear. Well, we will see what happens. It could be that Lindsey Graham does now refloat this idea of sending, manages to get his sanctions bill through Congress, and that he does indeed land on Donald Trump's desk, in which case Trump will be facing some very difficult decisions and could, in fact, face some serious political risks. It could be that Ursula von der Leyen will move forward with her sanctions package, sanctioning, as I said, countries that are not, in fact, Russia at all. But overall, my general feeling is that after the Trump-Putin call, the situation has been clarified, at least to a certain degree, that we now have the clearest signs that the Americans are starting to see that the war is being lost and that they're taking steps to distance themselves from the outcome. That the Russians won't be bullied or sweet-talked into a ceasefire that they don't want. That the United States has no leverage over Russia in military terms, and that the sanctions leverage has already been exhausted and has backfired horribly. The fact that Donald Trump is now talking about America's commitment to the war having been a disastrous mistake, or at least a big mistake, tends to reinforce that feeling. The Europeans, completely unreconciled to this, however, probably still working with Donald Trump's opponents, or in the case of Lindsey Graham, erstwhile allies, to try to change the situation and to turn it round. Well, that's my summary of the situation in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I came back to London to a situation where rumours are swirling around Prime Minister Starmer's position, and where there is growing reason to think that that position is starting to come apart. As to what those rumours are, I'm sure that most of you, or nearly all of you, have been following the news, and I'm not going to discuss it further, simply because, if only because, there is actually a police investigation underway, and I don't want to preempt in any way the results of a police investigation. What I would point to is a rather strange article that appeared in the Financial Times. You can find it today, and it is by Robert Shrimsley, and it reads, Keir Starmer's unreliable boyfriend problem. Now, when you read the body of the article, it does not touch on any of these rumours at all. It talks about how Starmer appears to have an inability to decide whether he's going to be a radical leftist or a more mainstream centrist. Articles like that are two a penny. They appear in the British media pretty much every day. But the title is eye-catching, and one wonders if it has appeared just by chance. Anyway, I'm not going to say more, because I don't think it's really appropriate to do so. The key thing to say is that Prime Minister Starmer's political position has been slipping, in my opinion, for some time. Opinion polls show him to be deeply unpopular with the British people. He has just concluded an agreement with the Europeans, the EU, which bears some similarity to Theresa May's proposals made before the Brexit war, in which Theresa May attempted to agree a Brexit deal, which is different and much more moderate in terms of British links with the EU than the one we eventually got. But as I said, he's unpopular. He's made that deal. I suspect that deal isn't popular with everybody, and certainly not in the working class Labour seats where people voted heavily for Brexit. So he's unpopular there. There's been complaints that he's been devoting too much time to foreign policy, which is a way of saying that he's been devoting too much time to the issue of Ukraine. His economic policy is coming apart. I noticed that there was some discussions, I saw some discussions about the state of inflation in Britain. Headline inflation is around 3.6%, I believe. It might actually be higher than this. There doesn't seem to be any real way of tackling this problem, at least no way of tackling this problem successfully. So we're told that inflation is too high. There is an increasing, growing deficit. The government is under major pressure to make concessions and to reverse some of its disability cuts, some of its cuts, to various social benefits. the government altogether appears to be adrift. It's taken a step towards Europe, which will be unpopular with some of its erstwhile supporters, and the Prime Minister himself, visionless and politically incompetent as he is deeply unpopular. Now, if these rumours crystallise into something, then of course all of this could be brought to a particular crisis point. I don't know whether that's going to happen, and that will depend a lot on the police investigation, which, as I've said previously, I don't want to anticipate or preempt. But I'm going to make a general observation, which is that I don't myself think that Prime Minister Starmer is going to remain Prime Minister of Great Britain for much longer, regardless of whether or not these rumours are true. I think, as I said, that his political position was already starting to crumble long before these stories, these recent stories, appeared. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if these rumours and the events which preceded them are connected with growing unease about Prime Minister Starmer and his position. Just saying. So, I don't think he's going to be Prime Minister for very much longer. Exactly how he's going to be led out of the door, I don't know. But going back to that curious fact remarked upon by many people, the fact that after his telephone call with Putin, Donald Trump spoke to various European leaders, but not to Keir Starmer. I have a feeling, this is my guess, that the reason that Trump didn't call Starmer was because his team has told him that Starmer is not going to be around for very long, that it might be better not to call Starmer anyway at this time, given that that might be seen as some kind of endorsement. Who knows? And that anyway, it's better, since Starmer is going anyway, to keep a distance. Well, there it is. That's what I think. We'll see whether my expectations that we're living in the last weeks or months of Starmer's time turns out to be true. It's very difficult, by the way, to remove a British Prime Minister, especially one with a big majority in the House of Commons. It can only be done by members of his own party. And though there is a lot of disaffection within his party, the Labour Party has no prior history of removing its leaders in this way, especially when that is done about a year after that leader has won a landslide victory in a general election. So were it to happen, it would be unprecedented, and it would speak of the depth of the crisis that we are looking at in Britain today. But anyway, we'll see whether I'm right about that. We'll see whether the Americans really are now generally trying to distance themselves from the Ukraine debacle. But my own sense is that over the next couple of programs, maybe for several programs, on the topic of Ukraine, are we once again talking mostly about the conduct of the war. The diplomacy will finally take the backstage, or at least again take the backstage. Well, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget, if you've liked this program, don't forget also you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.